Tonight, Stugotz, again, the American football machine, the professional football machine roars back to life as we spend our 10th consecutive season asking each other, is Kirk Cousins good? We do not know. The Vikings looked very bad in week one. They actually overwhelmed Tampa, but lose at home because they couldn't stop turning the ball over. Justin Jefferson is obviously the best receiver to ever catch footballs, but the Minnesota Vikings ever seem to be totally good. And in prime time, Kirk Cousins.
A take that will go totally unchecked.
He had 9 catches for 150 yards. He's great. Yeah. You're saying he's the greatest of all time? Better than Jerry Rice?
All I'm telling you is
I'm not even sure he's the best Vikings receiver ever.
Randy Moss, CC. I mean,
he's great, though.
Ahmad Rashad.
Okay, I may indeed
great, Mike. Look him up.
Be a prisoner of the moment.
Look up the word great.
Go ahead and look up Ahmad Rashad's numbers and put them next to Justin Jefferson's beginning of his career.
Did you think he hadn't heard of Ahmad Rashad when you said look him up?
Yeah.
What he says is look it up so that you can look it up. He doesn't know the numbers. The numbers are not what Justin Jefferson is doing.
I know they're good, though. I mean, Tommy Kramer was the quarterback. Those were good teams, Dan. You know that.
What you think are good numbers in a time that was not the passing age were not actually good numbers compared to what they're doing
I
right now.
wouldn't be surprised if Justin Jefferson will eclipse Ahmad Rashad's career this season.
That's correct.
Ahmad Rashad's rookie year, he had 29 catches for 500 yards. It's a good average, though.
You could keep going. That's 3 games for Justin Jefferson.
I was shocked when I found out Ahmad Rashad was a football player because I always knew him as the NBA inside stuff guy.
Same note.
Yeah,
same note.
Had no idea he was a professional football player.
That is funny.
He was always after Pee Wee's Playhouse talking about the NBA. Why would I ever think he was a part of the Purple
Summer
People
Sanders.
He backed up his rookie campaign with 30 catches for 409 yards.
Yeah, you
Sophomore
look him up.
slump.
You look him up, Mike Ryan. Stugotz says a thing, has no backing for it, tells you to look it up, hopes it just goes away.
But then he had back-to-back 1,100-yard seasons, Dan.
Yeah, in 51 career games, Justin Jefferson is just 25 yards away from 5,000 for his career. In the 7-year career in Minnesota, +2 in St. Louis and 1 in Buffalo.
Yeah.
It would appear that Justin Jefferson by midseason will catch up to.
Yes.
Yeah, well, no, by the end of the season, I think he will surpass the 10-year career of Ahmad Rashad.
It was a great career. I think Justin Jefferson already is the leading receiver in Bears history.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you want more Ahmad Rashad coverage, the award-winning God Bless Football, where Stugotz is asked by his producer, will you please get better, and he simply refuses.
Just be careful because the way that you said that is I know that I'm going to get like an email or something where Ahmad Rashad has been requested to be on the show. Yeah.
If you project...
You want him on?
No. If you project what Justin Jefferson has done since his rookie season, where he came out the gates with 1,400 yards, and you just add 200 yards to that like he's done every year, he might actually cash in on Tyreek Hill's prediction of 2,000 yards this season.
I don't want to actually talk about the Vikings.
Well, I wanted to hold you accountable for your take, and I think you might be right.
You shouldn't hold me accountable for my take because very obviously, just watching him run, I can tell you he's as good as anyone who has ever caught footballs.
I'm reading up on Ahmad Rashad's wedding where Bill Cosby walked his ex-wife, down the aisle and O.J. Simpson was his best man. Yeah, it was same wedding.
Wedding pics have not aged well.
I think Michael Jordan was in the wedding party as well.
Ahmad Rashad, great friend.
Yes.
This is on ProFootballHistory.com.
Or terrible friend, depending on what he knew.
Regardless, I didn't want to talk about the Vikings. I don't want to talk about the Eagles tonight.
Well, if he knew, it would make him a better friend, right? With the OJ thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, depending, I guess.
Right.
I don't
Not
know.
person, but friend.
Do you have the prism of a fiend?
O.J. Simpson's best friend was Al Cowling. He proved that.
Is it Al Cowling or is it Cowlings?
I think there's an S.
I think there's an S, and I think this one's been a tricky one for you since 1997.
That's a fine, too.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah, there's an S at the end. Al Cowlings.
Just a dollar. That is notorious thing that happens to old people, the swallowing of S's.
You've done that since you cracked open the microphone. You've been calling him Al Cowling since Judge Ito.
Regardless, I didn't want to talk about
How'd we end up here?
Tonight's Thursday night game.
Ahmad Rashad, you actually got us here.
Yeah.
As is often the case, Billy, how
I
did we
wanted to
get
talk
here
about Summer Sanders.
is in a mirror.
Well, he knows it, and then he asks how we got here. I mean,
He does know it.
great magic trick.
It's not so great. It's annoying. So rewinding to last Thursday night's game,
Yeah.
the Chiefs. Did you just flick a booger off of your finger?
I
right
did
there?
not. I
You've been
swear I
playing
did
with
not.
that booger. You've been playing with that booger the entire segment.
There's little fuzzy things on my microphone. It's
You're like
not,
Russ Cole in in True Detective. You're just constantly like
it's not a booger.
picking a booger out.
Yeah, it's not a booger.
There's a booger in my
No
hands.
booger in my hand.
I'm driving a Lincoln. I'm rolling a booger.
Last Thursday, the Chiefs and the Lions played a game, and everyone got very mad at Mike Tirico for saying after that game. And this has an asterisk for the Lions. The Lions have been bad for so long. Lions fans have suffered more than any fans in football.
Can't they just have a win?
But there was an asterisk on it because two people weren't playing that are important, Travis Kelce and Chris Jones.
You know what's crazy is I think that the Lions were really all that good in that game, and they won at Arrowhead largely for reasons that you just identified. But they had their own Kadarius Toney and Marvin Jones, who if it weren't for Kadarius Toney would be talked about as not the fast switch player of the week presented by Gatorade. No. As one of the worst receivers on the planet.
But what I wanted to talk about, a lot of people talked about Kelce, and obviously, Stugotz, like I don't need to explain this to you.
He's good.
Obviously, but not just good. The Lions did indeed win the game. However, those games, for a long time now, the reason the Kansas City Chiefs have hosted 5 straight AFC championship games is because at the end of those games, Mahomes to Kelce is really important. Like hugely, hugely important, Mahomes to Kelce if you need to win by a point. But what I wanted to talk about, and we've had this conversation for many, many years around here. Chris Jones was in the stands for that game, holding out and losing a lot of money. What's he rooting for as a result in that situation? Because if I'm Chris Jones and I want to put pressure on management to pay me when I never have leverage and these teams have all of the leverage, the way you do it is the way Emmitt Smith did it to Jimmy Johnson many years ago. Sat out 2 games. Jimmy Johnson started 0-2. And good God, did they get him signed fast. Because the expectations on that team are through the roof. And so I ask you, Chris Jones is watching that game.
With his agent.
Honestly, you know how his agent's feeling.
Agents. He was sandwiched in between them.
Yes.
You do mean sandwiched. At Arrowhead Stadium. I don't know how they're hosting a World Cup game years from now.
They pack it in, yeah.
It is old.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how much I enjoy that. That's another S that got swallowed there. Not just Al Cowling, but not agent, but agents. Sitting next to the economy of Chris Jones, you know what they're rooting for. That is what they're rooting for.
And just as hard for the Jaguars this week.
But what was Chris Jones wanting there? Well, he's got friends on the team.
Oh, he was wanting a loss. Are you kidding me? He's wanting a loss. He wants the defense to play bad. He wants no one to get pressure on the quarterback. Of course.
He wants to be missed,
Yes.
correct?
Yep. I mean, it's an 0-1 start. Big deal. Sign me and we'll overcome it. We'll be fine.
Chris Jones is a prolific postseason pass rusher. Prolific. He for whatever reason, maybe his name is just built out of a random name generator where we never talked about Frank Clark really or Chris Jones.
We talked a lot about them. It's just they had bigger stars on offense.
Yeah,
We
it's
like
because
offense
Kelsey
more.
and Tyreek
Yes.
Hill and Patrick Mahomes, like they are phenomenal players that they've had along that defensive line that just get totally buried by all the excitement. Understandably so, I guess.
He's an excellent defensive player. There seem to be a lot of those in this league. They have a small amount of time to make money, and they don't often have leverage. Also, I told you many times, in that sport, the way to win is to have Mahomes at value. It allows you to keep everyone else. Otherwise, you start losing Tyreek Hill and everybody else because it's a salary cap. And they can't keep all of those people, and they certainly can't keep all those people happy because those people are breaking their bodies for that money. The transaction is clear and it is cruel. It is, I'm going to damage myself in exchange for dollars, and there are a limited number of dollars that our business has to run, and Mahomes is no longer, I mean, he's still actually at value.
He is. Right.
But
yeah. And with each passing new high water mark, he becomes more valuable.
But Chris Jones had 15 and a half sacks, and he sees the guy on San Francisco, Bosa, get his big deal, and he wants some of that, and he deserves some of that. He's one of the best pass rushers in the league. And I'm amazed that we've arrived at a place where the pass rusher is more valuable than the guy that could score touchdowns. The guy who could prevent touchdowns is more valuable than Austin Eckler. It's crazy.
The running back position is not valued that way, but if the quarterbacks are going to eliminate the running game by throwing everything in 1.5 seconds, you need a guy who gets there in 1/8 of a second.
Right. Well, he's one of those guys.
And it made me think, though, one of the great geniuses in this sport, God, he's good at it. Jadeveon Clowney holding out so he doesn't ever have to participate in the cruelty of training camps. And he's just like, I'll come in on week 1. I'll rush your passer. I'm 6'7" with the wingspan of a pterodactyl. No practices for me. I'll just run as hard as I can. Wait till you see if I can get there 1 1/8 of a second after just taking the entire – Dalvin Cook did the same thing. What the hell do I want to do training camp for? I will sign up. These 17 games are hard, man. I'll sign up and I'll get there when I get there. But that hurt Burrow week 1. That 82 yards to got 6 first downs.
That felt like a preseason game for Joe Burrow.
I mean, it was. You after signing for the richest contract in history, you come out and are incompetent, at least in part, because you were hurt and couldn't play in the preseason at all, and it's going to take you a minute. Like, that had to suck for Burrow.
Yeah, there's been
It'll be fun.
There's been a lot of bad football played earlier on. Unders are more and more of a thing earlier in the season because of teams and how they approach preseason now, which is just don't get hurt, and they'll grow into their schemes.
Well, that's what's funny about the first 3 months of the season. All the analysis is irrelevant until guys start getting hurt. You realize, okay, what's the team look like when I need Chris Jones in a playoff game to get me a sack?
What if they shortened the season to avoid the first part and just added the games onto the back end?
Huh?
I got it.
No, you don't.
Clowney's been a bust, huh?
I knew you didn't have it. Katie Barnes is an award-winning feature writer for ESPN. You know that I still admire the writers out there.
One of the few.
Writing. I know. Nobody else cares, but I admire the writers, the long-form feature writers, doing the reporting, doing the journalism, doing the craftsmanship that has less value today than it has ever had, but is more important today, I think, than it's ever been because of the impact of what I believe the written word is and how it can be felt. It can be like music. They wrote a book here, Fair Play, How Sports Shape the Gender Debate. And this is a difficult time in America, and I don't know if Katie feels safer now than 4 or 5 years ago, now that some of this discomfort is in front of a really divided America. But again, I will say, important work they are doing. So thank you for being on with us. Why'd you write Fair Play? Explain to me and us the story of how we get to you dedicating yourself to the writing of a book, which is really hard, really challenging to pour your life into hours and days of something like this.
Yeah, well, thank you for that rousing introduction. I really appreciate it. I decided to write Fair Play mostly because I felt truly called to do it. I mean, I really think that's probably the one thing that allowed me to finish the book. I started writing about transgender athletes and school policy in particular in 2018. It was my first piece published, and I never expected that it would be the professional, cornerstone of my career, but it became that. And I really felt like someone needed to go long on the topic, and no better person than myself, I suppose.
But why is it important? Because you're talking about now a passion that becomes your life's work, your identity. I don't think people necessarily understand what goes into writing a book. All of it. If you're proud of your work and you want to make sure it's good, it is an incredible undertaking. So
it sure is.
But it's hard. It's not. It's less so, I think, when you're working from a position of passion and it gives you advocacy, power, activism. It gives you the ability through the written word to help people understand a little better.
Yeah, I think, you summed it up pretty well. It's incredibly challenging. And I think especially in these moments, I started writing this book 3 years ago, and Idaho had just passed HB 500, which was the first law in the country that restricted transgender athlete participation, particularly transgender girls. But the rest of it hadn't happened yet. Leah Thomas hadn't been in the pool yet. As a member of the University of Pennsylvania women's team, we were at one state, not 23 states. And so this issue, while I think being something that I was generally interested in and thought was worthwhile from an exploration standpoint and also an explanatory standpoint, I didn't expect to be in a live news event. And that's really where we've been for 2 years. And so for me as a writer, and also as a non-binary person, that became both really challenging, but also I think really demanding intellectually to meet the moment that we're in. And that really drove the journalism in these pages.
Pressurized, correct? Because you feel the responsibility of that. You're no longer writing it for just yourself. You're no longer an author who's just trying to profit writing a book. You're doing activism. You're doing work trying to change America.
Well, I think activism is a little strong. I am still a journalist at heart, so I wouldn't describe myself as an activist. I think when it comes to what people can expect to find in this book, I really sought to answer questions. I was getting a lot of questions. It didn't matter where I was. As soon as somebody found out my specialty and what I do for a living, I got a ton of questions. And I really felt like I should start to answer them. And so Fair Play really seeks to answer, I think, a lot of the common questions that people have around transgender athletes in particular, but also situates that conversation in a larger conversation about how we approach gender in sports. Whether we're talking about women's sports on television, or we're talking about American Ninja Warrior, a personal fashion favorite of mine, or we're talking about, who gets to play and who gets to count as a girl. All of that is intrinsically linked, and I really sought to explain those linkages in a way that was palatable and digestible for a greater public.
Can you give us examples of some of the questions you were getting over and over and over again?
Oh, yeah. Folks were asking me, is it fair? Or they would ask about a specific athlete, right? I got a lot of questions about Leah Thomas. Or, they would ask me about, well, what does this mean? Like, what are the rules? So-and-so is a friend of mine and has a transgender kid. Can they play sports? Or I would get questions that would say things like, well, I don't believe that this should happen. Why should this happen? Why are people in favor of this? And so the questions I was getting really ran the gamut of what you would expect, some of which were broad, some of which were very specific. It just kind of depended.
I would think, Katie, to the uninitiated, that one of the most common things encountered here is that I think most people listening to this would talk about science and say and understand men have physical advantages over women in sports. Period. Now, it's more complicated like that because gender is nuanced, and the argument on the other side can be about, no, it's not. Science says it's not nuanced, but gender can be found on a spectrum. And so when people come to you quite reasonably and curiously and say they don't like the idea of women's sports allowing for the transgender to compete, what is the fairest response to that most reasonably?
Oh, usually I'm like, how much time do you have? And do you want to get a drink? Because it's going to take a minute. I think folks really crave a sort of simplistic answer about what is fair and what isn't fair. And for me, the way that I approach it is I've read a lot of science. I've read a lot of studies reported in this space for a long time. And the answer almost all the time is that it depends. It depends on what we're talking about. And those are the things I really try to address, both in my professional work as a journalist and also in the pages of Fair Play. In that, if we're talking about elite sports and Olympic level sports and Division I college, my answer is a little bit different than if we're talking about 7-year-olds. And the issue in the United States right now is that the legislation that is being passed across the country makes no distinction between the level of sports that it applies to. And in fact, most of these laws go out of their way to specifically enumerate how broad they are. So talking about, K-12 sports being affected, but also like collegiate intramural sports. And I think we would agree that, collegiate intramural volleyball is not the same thing as Division I level volleyball. And so for me, when it comes to science, I take that same approach. Like if we're talking about kids, the conversation is different than if we're talking about elite athletes, than if we're talking about collegiate athletes or professional athletes. And that nuance is really important in this conversation, because the science matters a little bit more depending on the stakes of the competition and the level of scrutiny of those athletes.
But why can't that conversation be had peacefully?
Because I would say that thus far, where we are from a legislative standpoint is that there are people who really feel attacked, and arguably are. And there are folks who, while they may say that they're interested in science-based policy, their approach would say that perhaps that they are not, or suggest that they aren't. And so, this issue is being used as a proxy for a broader legislative attack on LGBTQ plus Americans. But within that conversation, there are folks asking reasonable questions, and those should be answered.
Because Miami, a podcast I am really proud of that Billy Corbin does a great job of on Fridays, attacks DeSantis on some of these fronts all the time, because what's happening in Florida is super alarming, and it's hostile. It's something that would make me feel deeply, deeply unsafe in this Florida, which is why Stugotz, Dwayne Wade moves out of Florida and says it does not feel safe for my child here. Let's play some sound from Ron DeSantis, please.
How do you compete for 3 years on the men's swim team and then switch to the women's and you win the championship? I'm sorry, that is a total fraud, and everybody knows it. And so it's taking away opportunities for young girls, women athletes. They're working hard. They want to win championships. And then you're basically saying you got to compete against biological males. So that's wrong. And in the state of Florida, we are protecting the integrity of women's sports.
I will ask you again, why can't we have this conversation peacefully?
I think it's not for me to respond to Ron DeSantis specifically. I think from a broad perspective, the things that are being said in Florida mirror things that I've heard across the country, and that is reflected in the laws that are passing. Why we can't have this conversation peacefully. I do have this conversation peacefully all the time. I think one of the things that's been really challenging is how politicized the question of transgender athletes, particularly transgender girls and women participating in girls and women's sports, has become. However, that level of politicization that we see in our public discourse, I don't find reflected in the everyday conversations that I have with people who are seeking to understand. And so for me, that's what I focus on, because I'm not a politician and I'm not an activist. So you keep trying to describe me as one. And so I focus on the conversations that I can control and what I know in terms of how people are engaging on this issue from an everyday community-based level. And those are the folks that I seek to serve with Fair Play.
Oh, but forgive me, honestly forgive me if you thought that by me saying activist, that was some sort of insult to your objectivity. No, why I admire it, why I admire the work is because you are pouring yourself into objectively and fairly trying to report this out unemotionally. And in today's America of this climate, trying to get facts out there, you're doing really important work. It's where journalism to me becomes activism, even by accident, because you're trying so hard to be fair about this and reasonable about this as the laws keep getting more hostile.
Now that was well said. You finally nailed it.
But this is what I mean, man, look at what is happening in Florida. Katie is a politicized, by doing this work on behalf of a cause, they, forgive me, you would say it's more hostile now than it was 3 or 4 years ago, correct? That it's more dangerous. What you're doing right now is more dangerous than what you've ever done, and you've dedicated your life to it.
Yeah, there's no question about that. We are I mean, there's a tremendous amount of hostility, I think, felt. And I know that you live in Florida, so of course you're focused on Florida. But, the reality is, it's like I'm from Indiana. And from a legislative standpoint, Indiana has passed a number of laws that I, as on an individual level, feel like, would affect my safety. That's something that I think about. I think it's really challenging for queer and trans people who live in these 23 states. It's almost half the country who've passed restrictive legislation specifically about sports, but that has grown into a much broader, suite of legislation, I suppose, that seeks to restrict a number of different, functions of everyday life for queer and trans folks, specifically trans people. And that is not a conversation that we were having 5 years ago. It's not a conversation that we were really having 3 years ago. And so this has been very quick in terms of a rapid escalation of legislative attacks. But yeah, I mean, it's a real thing in terms of just how I personally feel as an individual who's reporting in this space. But I think, that's emblematic and reflective of how many, many queer and trans people are feeling right now.
The name of the book, if you want to learn, Fair Play, How Sports Shape the Gender Debates. If I could describe it in a word, what it's aspiring to, is it the first word? Is it fair?
Yeah, I think so. I always seek to have my journalism underpinned in fairness and accuracy in a pursuit of truth. And so I hope folks find it to be informative. I hope they find it impactful and helpful in terms of just understanding how we got to this place that we are, where we are right now, and where we're going from here.
Katie, thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.